Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial. I'm Brad, the creator of Expanse, the volumetric sky, clouds, and atmospheres plugin for Unity's high-definition render pipeline. And today we're going to be talking about how to create cloudscapes. I've been mulling over how I want to do this tutorial for about a week or two, kind of planning it out, thinking about what I want to say, because, if you didn't think this already, modeling clouds is pretty hard. um, there's all sorts of different things to consider, right? There's sort of one side of it, which is trying to make our clouds look real, right? And we don't necessarily even have a great intuition for what real clouds look like. And then there's sort of the other side of it too, which is making our clouds look good, right? Not just real, but making them elicit some kind of emotion or remind people of a particular experience they had, or sort of all of these softer artistic things that we do when we're trying to create an environment for a game. And the reason I have Breath of the Wild up here, the Zelda game, is because I think it balances these two things beautifully. I think Breath of the Wild's clouds are this great combination between something that is sort of physically plausible or physically realistic, right? But at the same time, is also unrealistic or stylized. They're clearly not real clouds, but they do look like clouds. They do look like they could be clouds in this fictional land of Hyrule. And when we're modeling clouds, the reality is that the question of realism is actually kind of nebulous. For instance, does this look like a real cloud? Do these look like realistic clouds? What about these? If you saw these in a game, would you say, wow, the clouds, they just look so realistic. Look at those, And yet all three of these, they're real pictures of clouds, right? They're definitionally realistic clouds because they're real clouds. And so the reality of the situation is that clouds just look weird, and oftentimes they look way weirder than we remember them looking. And so it's crucial to always use as many references as you can find when you're trying to model clouds, and when you're trying to come up with the visual look for your clouds, because what you want to end up with is something like Breath of the Wild, where you have some aspects of realism, right? Some things that make your clouds look plausible. But then you idealize parts of them too, right? To make them look not just like how clouds really look, but how you want clouds to look, or how you remember clouds looking. So moving into the rendering side of things, the first important observation that we can make about clouds is that clouds are fluid. And what I mean by this is that they're not a solid, they're not a surface, but they're a volume of particles, right? So normally, when we think about rendering stuff in computer graphics, we think about going into Maya and creating a mesh with a bunch of triangles and extruding things and subdividing triangles, subdividing surfaces, and this just won't work for clouds, because clouds are not a hard surface like my hand or like this sparkling water bottle. They're a volume of water droplets, and the way that light interacts with these two sorts of things is very different. Light interacts with surfaces by bouncing off of it, but it interacts with volumes by scattering through it. So one thing that we could imagine doing for modeling clouds is we could imagine going in and hand placing every single little particle until we have something that approximates a cloud, and then we render all those particles individually. And maybe it looks great if we have a billion years to do that, or come up with some algorithm to do it, but then find a way to render it efficiently in real time. And this is just something that we can't do, basically, right? So instead what we're going to do is we're going to come up with what I'm going to call a statistical description of a gas, a statistical description of a cloud. And this is going to be comprised of a couple different components. One component is the density field, which is going to basically be a big texture, sort of a big lookup table that tells us where in space particles are and where they're not. So if I'm looking at a particular spot, the density field will tell me, oh, hey, Brad, there's lots of particles here, right? Or it'll tell me, Brad, there's not that many particles here. But it won't tell me where the particles specifically are, right? It won't tell me where each individual particle is, but it'll just be sort of a measure of how many there are in a particular spot. And then the second component of the model is going to be the molecular properties, which are going to be the extinction coefficients, which tell us what color of light the particles in the gas absorb. the scattering coefficients, which tell us what color of light they reflect or that bounces off of them, and the phase function, which tells us if there's any preferred direction to the scattering behavior. If all of that sounded like a bunch of gibberish, don't worry, we blazed through it pretty quickly. The reason for that is because I actually have another video, which I'll link somewhere over here, that will go into more detail about this. It's the video where I talk about atmospheric scattering and modeling the Earth's atmosphere. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, then I recommend you just go and quickly take a detour, watch the first 10 or 15 minutes of that video, and then come back. So let's talk about how we're going to model the density field for these clouds. The basic strategy is that we're going to use a lot of layered noises that are just going to be sort of composited together in various ways. And for those of you who don't know, noises are randomly generated patterns. We're going to make sure that they're tiled at various rates so that we get lots of small scale detail, because small scale detail is crucial for selling the scale of clouds, right? When you look up at clouds, if they were just all smooth, it might be a little bit tougher to get a sense of how big they are. But when you look up at clouds and you see that there's all of these tiny little details crammed into just a small part of the cloud, then it really gives you this visual. It's a great visual indicator for the fact that those clouds are really, really big. They're kilometers wide, right? So diving into specifically what some of those noises are, the first noise we're going to talk about is the bass noise. And this kind of forms the general texture flavor of the clouds, right? It doesn't really tell us anything about the shapes of the clouds per se, but it does tell us, like, once those shapes are there, kind of what some of that small scale detail is going to look like. So this one's just kind of a bumpy, cauliflower-y noise. The coverage noise is what's going to actually define the broader shapes of the clouds. It's going to be sort of a 2D texture that's going to tell us from above where there are clouds and where there are not clouds. And then the structure noise is going to add a level of detail, an additional level of detail to the clouds. And then the detail noise is going to add yet another level of fine-grained detail. And after we've done all that, we'll have clouds. And if you're looking at these and you're like, Brad, those look terrible, don't worry, I agree with you. They look really, really bad. But our clouds are not going to look like this. This is just an instructional example. So that's it, right? We just layer the noises together and we're done with our density field. No, that's actually not the case. We're going to have some other higher level shaping parameters that are going to give us a little bit more control over the way the clouds look. So in particular, we'll have things like wind skew, and we'll have ways of rounding off the tops of the clouds and other stuff like that. That'll give us a little bit more shaping and control for how the clouds ultimately end up looking. So great, we've got our density field, and if we just render it with our extinction and scattering coefficients, our phase function, what's it look like? It looks, if you can't tell, pretty bad. These kind of look a little bit like clouds. I mean, they're white, they're kind of fluffy, they're up in the sky, but that's where the similarities end. They do not look good. And maybe what you're thinking is, well, Brad, clearly you neglected the fact that clouds can cast shadows onto themselves. It looked like for every little point that you rendered, you just assumed that all the light from the sun was getting to that point, when really it's not. There could be light that's being diffused by the cloud to your left, the cloud to your right. And I would say, yeah, you're actually totally right. I totally forgot about that. So let's add that in. And this looks maybe equally as bad in just a different way. So we can see that now that we've actually added accurate self-shadowing, it's just way, way too much. So it's clear that scattering and extinction coefficients with vanilla self-shadowing are just not going to be enough. They're not going to get clouds to look realistic or good. If we simulated something called multiple scattering, which for lack of better terminology is just light bouncing around many, many, many times inside the cloud, then they might look more accurate, but this is too computationally expensive for us to do, so we're going to have to find another way. And that other way is something that we're going to call the attenuative lighting model. And the basic principle behind the attenuative lighting model is this. We start with the clouds with maximum light, basically, with all the light that they could have with no shadowing. And then we add in some, but not all, of that self-shadowing behavior in particular ways. And then we end up with some clouds that are not too bright, but not too dark, and they're dark in the right places, and they're bright in the right places, and they look much better. Of course, the challenging part here is deciding how to mix in that self-shadowing and to end up with a good result, right? And I have a brain there, but really that should be like a paintbrush or something, because that's really the artistic part of lighting these clouds is deciding how to tweak these self-shadowing parameters and some of these heuristics to get your clouds to look the way that you want them to. So before we dive into Unity and we play around with all this stuff, I just want to mention that Expanse's clouds rendering system is based on Andrew Schneider's work, and he was the mastermind behind the clouds in the game Horizon Zero Dawn, which is an awesome game, and also the clouds in the Decima engine from a year or two later. I would say pretty much every single modern volumetric cloud system, real-time volumetric cloud system, is based off of his work. So if you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely give his presentations a read. He's got two really solid presentations. One that was from 2015, and then one from 2017 that builds upon that first presentation. And I'll link them in the description so you can give him a read, because it's a great way to pay honor to his awesome work. All right, so we've gone over the theory. We know what the general strategy is, so it's time to make some clouds, right? Wrong. We need to look at references, like I mentioned in the fourth slide of the presentation, if you remember that long ago. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to take a look at a couple references. And the first one here is probably not what you would have expected that we were going to take a look at, right? I know when I think of clouds, I think of sort of small, puffy, floofy, marshmallowy looking things, right? That are kind of low to the ground and that move across the sky quickly. But these are cirrus clouds. They're frozen water crystals that are way high up in the air. And this is a type of cloud that you could imagine wanting to model. And so already you can see, maybe you thought of cirrus, maybe you're different than me and you thought of cirrus clouds when you thought reference photo, right? But for me, I definitely didn't. And when I Googled clouds and this came up, I was taken by surprise. And it just proved the point even further that oftentimes with clouds, we have preconceived notions of what they look like, but they can look way different. Here's another more sort of standard reference photo for some clouds. And you can see here something that we've got kind of this like silver lining kind of around the edge, right? So it's very bright around the edge, but then it's actually surprisingly dark here, right? This self-shadowing makes it pretty gray. So it's very, very bright around here. The sun is like right here, I think, but it's pretty dark underneath here. And then the other thing you can tell is that there's just a crazy amount of small scale detail here. They're very like fragmented, and they're not at all like smooth. They're very kind of almost like craggly in a sense, and they're not very organized either. They're not neat. There's all sorts of little tendrils coming off of them. Here is another great reference. This is from the Blood and Wine DLC to The Witcher 3. And by the way, we can use games as references too. We don't just need to use real photos, right? I love the way that these clouds kind of capture that look of the cloud that we saw in this frame, right? Or in this previous reference, where they've got sort of these splotchy tendrils around the edges, but they're also kind of like, they're kind of painterly, They look like they've been sort of done with a paintbrush. I think that looks very cool. And then here are some clouds that I think look the most kind of like what I think of when I think of clouds. But even these are, they're not very neat. They're very disorganized in a way that kind of doesn't map to the way that I think about clouds. When I think about low to the ground cumulus clouds, I think about these kind of neat little pockets of cloud with their sort of little, poofy, marshmallowy cotton ball thing. And I don't think about all this. This looks like a mess. This is like there's cloud everywhere, and there's big discernible shapes, but there's all sorts of little tendrils and stuff too, and it's way messier than I ever thought of. And then the other thing is that there's lots of shadowing in certain spots too, right? So they're not quite as bright and white as you would think they are. Okay, and then this is our final result, actually, hopefully, that we're going to get in the tutorial, and it's going to be based off of this reference photo. So we're going to end up with something that hopefully looks pretty similar, at least as similar as we can get it within the context of using Expanse. All right, so here we are in Unity, and you can notice that I have a pretty, pretty bad looking scene here right now, unless you're a big fan of black silhouettes and gray skies, matte gray skies. And this is because I have deleted pretty much everything in this scene. I just have this model of a city. I have a global volume that has an exposure on it, exposure component or whatever. And I have the main camera, which is not going to have any anti-aliasing on it, and which has a far clipping plane set to 300,000, so very far away. And in the editor, I also have a far away clipping plane. I have 150,000, but just something pretty big is what you want. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to put a sky in here and illuminate the world. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to go over to Expanse, go to Prefabs, Full Skies, and then drag the Expanse Cloudless Sky prefab onto our scene hierarchy. And you'll see that we have a sky, and it's nighttime. And the way that we can fix that is we go over to the time of day controller here, and we'll just drag the minute forward until it's daytime. Great, so now it's daytime. Great, so yeah, so we can see we have our sky, and we need to create a cloud layer. And the way that we can do that is we can go over to this Expanse Cloudless Sky game object here, and we can right-click and click Create Empty. And then right-click it, rename it. I'm going to rename it Clouds. And then I'm going to I got to drag it in here. I didn't actually end up dragging it in here. Great. Okay. And we can go over to the inspector now and click Add Component. And we're just going to type in Procedural Cloud Volume Block. So we can click that. And I'm going to go over to the name here. I'm going to say Cumulus Clouds. Cumulus clouds are sort of the small, puffy clouds you see close to the ground. That's kind of what we're modeling. If we take a peek at our reference again, right, these are cumulus clouds. So that's what we're going to call it. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to uncheck, and check this to get it to register. And now you can see we have a big gray mass above the ground here, right? And if we drag up here and zoom out a bunch and get to the top, we can see that we have here's our cloud layer, but it's not set up at all. It's pretty just a big homogeneous volume of water droplets. And we are going to change that. And the first thing that I want to do actually is I want to make sure that we don't have to deal with the sky, the clouds not being rendered at a high enough quality for us to author them accurately. So even though this might not be fast enough to run in your game for real-time performance, we're going to come over to the quality drop down here. And we are just going to set this to just a very high quality. We're going to turn reprojection frames off. If you can, if your editor frame rate's okay with that. And we're going to go to the coarse step range, and we're going to set this to something like 32 and 64. And the detail step range we're going to set to 72 and 168. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come over to the modeling tab, and we're going to start to define the general shape of the cloud volume. This is going to sort of tell us, I'm going to go above the clouds again right now, but it's going to tell us like how far around the clouds are going to extend, how tall, how thick they're going to be, that kind of stuff. So you can see by default we have an origin parameter here that's set to 0 and 6,000. For us, this is going to be too high since we're modeling cumulus clouds. We want them to be about 2 kilometers off the ground. So we're going to set this to something like 2,000. And you can see now we're blanketed in cloud fog because we brought them too far down. So we're going to go over here to the Y extent, which tells us how thick the cloud layer is. And we're going to set this to something like I don't know, 1500 maybe. And now you can see the clouds are no longer blanketing our little gray model of Lower Manhattan here. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I am going to check this curved box, and this will curve the clouds toward the horizon. So you can see this is without it, and this is with it. You get a little bit of a curve there. And now I'm going to set this attenuation distance to something like 20,000, just so that we get a nice kind of soft fade out here at the edge of the cloud volume. And we'll come back and we'll tweak these parameters again. This is just to get us started. The other parameter that's worth noting is the ramp up parameter here. So this will make it so that clouds are only drawn starting at a certain distance away from you. So if we set this to something like 15,000 on the one end and then 10,000 on the other end, you can see now that we've put a big hole in the cloud volume. Of course, this won't look nearly as bad once we actually have cloud shapes, but this is useful just in case, for instance, like your clouds, you're not using a texture resolution that's high enough to make close-up clouds look good. You just want to have good-looking clouds but far away. You can play with this ramp-up parameter and you can push them out further. We're going to leave it at 0 and 0 for now, though. Great. And then you can see we have all of these intensity sliders here, which correspond to the names of the noises we talked about. So there's structure, detail, coverage. The only thing we care about right now is just having the coverage intensity at 1. The rest of these we don't care about yet. Great, so we've defined the shape of our cloud volume roughly, so how far around clouds are going to extend. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to make this cloud volume a little bit more visible for while we author the noises. So I'm going to go down to the lighting tab here, and the density right now you can see is 250. And I'm going to increase that to 25,000. And now you can see that we've got a big blocky cloud volume here. That's very obvious where it is. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enable self-shadowing here with this checkbox, and that'll make it even darker. And this will make it a lot easier to see the clouds. Okay, and then actually one last thing, I'm going to drag the multiple scattering amount down, and now it's really very clear where the clouds are. And we'll go into what all those parameters mean more later, but for now, that's enough just to get us started with modeling the density field. Cool. So let's close up the lighting tab. Something I'm noticing now actually is that we've got more speckles here than I thought we were going to. But you know what? I actually think that's fine. So, if you want to, you can go and you can up the quality even more and see if you can really get those bad boys to go away. Actually, I think I will. So I'm just going to drag these step ranges up even more. But if your PC can't handle it, don't worry. That's a problem that we'll solve later without having to absolutely tank your performance. So now we're going to start to work on defining the different noises. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the Noise Editor tab. I got to turn off Night Light. Night Light, Night Light, Night Light. Good feature, but not good for when you're recording videos. Okay, before we do this part, I'm going to take a drink of water because this is going to take a little while. All right. So this noise editor foldout, it looks deceptively simple. Maybe there's only a couple parameters, but it actually is. It's what's going to allow us to craft our entire density field. And the way it's going to do that is that the first parameter here is just the quality of the noises, the resolution. And then basically what follows here is a selection drop-down that lets you select each of the different noise layers and then author the noise that you want for that layer. So you recognize some of these phrases from the presentation. We have the base noise and the structure and the detail. And then for each noise, for each layer, we have the different noise parameters. The type of noise, we've got the scale for the noise, the number of octaves, stuff like that, and we'll see what all these parameters do in a second. We're going to start with the base noise, and the noise type that we're going to choose here, we can cycle through them all. So constant looks terrible, but this is just a constant density field. It's just the same value everywhere. And it's really, really hard for it to sample this based on the heuristic it uses. We have value, Perlin, which is like a smoother version of value. Worley, which you can start to see some of those cell shapes in here. Inverse Worley, which gets you sort of that bumpy look. Perlin Worley, which is a mix of Perlin noise and Worley noise. And then brace yourself, curl. Which you should under no circumstances actually use for this purpose. Curl noise will come in later. So we're going to pick Perlin Worley here. And you know, depending on what you want, you could pick other different noise types, right? You might want a different type of noise for what you want to do, but I think Perlin Worley is a good starting point. And something we're going to do to make it even easier to see the type of noise and what the noise looks like is we're going to go back to the modeling tab, and where it says height gradient top down here, we're going to bring that lower value of the slider down. And now you'll see as we do that the top of the clouds kind of comes down a little bit, and it allows us to better see kind of what's going on internally here. Great, so I'm going to leave it at something like 0.5. And you'll notice now, unless you've got ripping through the metaverse quality on, that there's some pixelation artifacts. And this is because we have not tiled our base noise at all. So our base noise is just one copy stretching across this whole thing. And we're going to need to change that if we want to get rid of these pixelation artifacts. So what I'm going to do is instead I'm going to tile this 8 times. And now you can see it is extremely detailed. Just, you know, that really upped the amount of the scale here, right? And there's no more pixelation artifacts. But now it's a little bit too small, right? The clouds are kind of like, that's too much detail, right? So I'm going to go to the scale parameter here, and I'm going to decrease this to something like 8 and 8. I think that looks pretty good. The other things that we can do are we can play around with the Octaves parameter. The Octaves parameter kind of tells us how much detail it has. So here's 1 octave, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, 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 all the way up to 8. I'm going to use 7. And don't worry, this is all pre-computed, so it's not more expensive to do more octaves. There's the Octave Scale, which tells us for each layer of noise how much more detailed it is. So if we increase that, we can start to get some pretty crazy amounts of detail. I'm going to leave it at 2. And then there's the Octave Multiplier, which basically gives us the relative weight of the different layers or octaves of noise, the different layers of detail. And if we decrease this, it'll skew toward the first layer. And if we increase it, it'll skew towards the later layers. So I'm going to go for something like, I think 0.65 looks pretty good. I'm a fan of that. And then, you know what? I'm going to come in here and I'm going to tile this up to 12, actually, I think. I think that looks pretty good. And knowing very well that we're going to have to come back and tweak this again, probably. And I'm going to take a look at my reference again and kind of get a sense, yeah, like, you know, it's pretty, there's a lot of little bumpy guys in there. So I think that this will be good as a starting point. Great. So we have the base noise. Moving on, we're going to move to now the coverage noise, the coverage map, which is going to give us these clouds some shapes, turn it from one big round cloud pizza into some smaller little cloud marshmallows. So we're going to go over to the noise editor. I'm going to go to layer select, coverage. And let's leave it at this for now, actually. And let's go back over to the modeling tab. And let's go to coverage intensity here. And if we slide this to the left, you'll see that the clouds disappear. And sliding it to the right, they start to appear. and then all the way to the right is full cloud coverage. So we're going to want it somewhere in the middle, right? Because we're going to want some clouds, right? But we're not going to want like the entire sky to be black with cloud. So I'm going to put it at something like 0.85 for now. So I think this looks pretty decent, but if you look at our reference photo here, I think the clouds are a little bit more fragmented than they are here. You know, right here we've got this big swath of cloud, and then we kind of have this area that doesn't have very much, but here they're sort of broken up a little bit more. Like there's cloud here, and then there's a little bit of not cloud. The formations are a little smaller. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm just going to up the tile factor on the coverage noise. So noise editor, coverage for the layer select, and then tile. I'm going to up that to 4. And now you can kind of see that they're more evenly distributed than they were before. And I kind of like the way that looks, I think, actually. You can play around with the different noise types here, like inverse Worley will give you some pretty weird shapes. Worley is a pretty good one if you want very defined cloud shapes. You can up the number of octaves to get a little more detail, and maybe even pull down the tile factor. In fact, I actually like that a lot. I like Worley, octaves 4, and tile 2. So that's what I'm going to roll with. But you can really pick whatever you want here for your coverage noise, whatever you think looks good. So what else? The other thing I'm going to do now is I think there's too much cloud here. So I'm going to go back to modeling and coverage intensity, and I'm going to reduce it. Something like that, maybe. And now if I go and zoom back down to the city, I think the scale is starting to look about right. You know what? Maybe not. I think they need to be a little bit higher up. And by the way, I could have just pre-programmed this whole tutorial, but you know, I think it's a lot more useful for us to work through it together. So that's why I'm kind of tweaking different things, and we'll see. We got to go through the whole process. Otherwise, how are you going to do it on your own, right? From the ground up. So I'm going to come over to modeling, and I'm actually going to go to the height here. I'm going to set this to 3000, which I think looks a little better. And I'm going to up the Y extent, I think, to 1800. And now if I look at the reference photo, that scale-wise is pretty good. Again, they look terrible, right? But just in terms of how big they are from the ground and sort of the way that they're patterned around each other, I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so let's go back above the clouds for this next part, and let's zoom in a little bit more. So you can see from out here, they look very, very detailed, but then when you start to zoom in, they're not so detailed. So now is when we add the coverage, or add the structure and the detail noise to make them look even better. And you can see they're moving right now, and I actually kind of want to stop that because it makes it harder to author them. So I'm going to go down to the Movement tab, and I'm just going to check Use Offset, and that'll stop them from moving. Great, so now heading back to the Modeling tab, I'm going to come over to Structure Intensity here, this slider. I'm just going to increase that. And you can see it's not going to look very good, but this is going to let us now start to have visible coverage or visible structure noise for us to edit. So back to the noise editor. The layer select, we're going to hit Structure. And I'm going to change this to Worley here. And the reason I'm going to do that is that if you look here in the reference, this sort of has, there's sort of these bumpy shapes here, right? These kind of cauliflower-looking shapes. There's all these tendrils, right? And we'll handle that later too. But right now, for sort of the next level of detail, I want to get these kind of like bumpy, marshmallowy shapes. And Worley noise is great for that because here, I'll show you. If I up the tile factor to something like 8, and then I reduce the number of octaves to 1, and I go to the structure intensity here, and bring it up a lot more. Here, I might need to do it even more. Okay, at 64. There you go. That'll do it. The tile factor at 64. You can see now with the structure intensity, I can sort of like turn these into little meta balls or something. But obviously, we don't want to do that, right? That looks pretty bad. So I'm going to up the tile to 72 actually. I'm going to keep the scale. I think I'm going to put the scale at 8 so I get a little more detail out of the noise, a little more texture resolution out. And then I'm going to up the number of octaves to 4. And now I'm going to come back to the modeling tab and I'm going to start to bring in some of that structure. And I feel like I like it. I think I like it right around there. And you know what? Let's see what happens. What if I just up this to something like 128? Maybe even like 168? I mean, that looks pretty good, but that might actually be too much right now. All right, I'm gonna settle somewhere in the middle. I'm gonna say 108 for the structure noise for the tile factor. And then maybe I'll up the octave multiplier to 0.75 just to, no, 0.5 is good. Great, so now we have structure and we can increase the intensity, decrease it. I'm gonna put it up to something like 0.2 for now. Great, so now we can move to the detail noise. And so I'm gonna bring the detail intensity slider here, bring that up. Again, we're gonna see that it's not gonna do anything reasonable, but we're gonna adjust the noise in a second. And for this, I actually want to go down toward the city. And this is because what's important about the detail noise is getting these tendrils and selling that sense of scale. And this is easiest to do, I think, from the ground because it helps. Our references from the ground, and if we look, we can sort of get a sense of what the scale of that detail is. So go to the noise editor. Now selecting the detail layer. I'm going to use the inverse Worley here. So, Worley gave us bumps. Inverse Worley is going to kind of give us tendrils out. And then I'm going to up the tile. I'm going to reduce the scale, I think, to 8 and 8. And then I'm going to up the tile factor to something like 256. So if I come over to the detail now, you can see this is before, and then there's after. And then I think I'm going to up the octave multiplier to 0.75, and the number of octaves will go to 3. Great. Okay, cool. And now just to match our reference a little bit better, I think I'm going to bring the coverage in a little more. Just have more cloud. Yeah, coverage somewhere around 0.85. And then the other thing I'm noticing now too, actually, is I think that these are a little bit too thick. These clouds are a little bit thinner. So I'm going to, instead of making this 1800, I'm going to go down to like 1500, I think. I think that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to bring the origin Y down to 2800. Yeah, there you go. So naturally, still looks quite bad. But, it's looking a little bit more like clouds now. And don't worry, we'll make it look even better. But, yeah. Okay, the last noise I want to handle here is one that I didn't mention, which is detail warp. And what this is going to let us do, as you can see in the reference, there's sort of little like the tendrils are kind of swirly, They kind of swirl around at the edges here. And I want to get some of that swirliness on these tendrils. These are pretty static, right? They don't look like they're swirling around too much. And so that's what the detail warp noise is going to let us do. And here, so we're going to layer select detail warp. Here is where we're finally going to use this curl noise. So we're going to select curl, and I'm going to up the tile factor to something like 64. And now I'm going to go to modeling and just drag up this intensity parameter, and you can see that this is going to start. Here, one second. Let me bring the FOV up so that you can see it. This is going to start to swirl that detail. So, you can easily go overboard with this, right? I think it's best when you just make it pretty subtle. In fact, even that is too much, I think. I'm going to go to the noise editor again. I'm going to pull the number of octaves down to 2. And I'm going to up this. I'm going to pull the scale down to 8 and 8. And now the modeling. We're going to pull the warp intensity up. You know what? I'm going to bring the tile factor up even more. 128. And now I'm going to bring the intensity down. Just a slight warp. There we go. Great. Okay, so we have our first pass at our density field. Our clouds still look like soot. They look like crap, but that's okay. Chances are we're going to be coming back to this density field, these noises, and tweaking them some more. But for now, this is plenty good for what we need. And now we can start to do a pass at trying to light them and make them look better. We're going to come over to the lighting tab. And here, we're just going to do a couple of things just to basically build the attenuative lighting model step by step. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the anisotropy to 0. We're going to set the ambient strength range to 0 and 0. And we're going to set the vertical probability strength to 0. The depth probability bias all the way up to 1. And the rest of our parameters have already been set for us, but the multiple scattering amount down to 0, and self-shadowing on. Great. So you can see now we have maximum self-shadowing, right? Our clouds look like they did in that second image. And if we uncheck self-shadowing, now our clouds look like they did in that first image. We have none. So we have none of our sort of attenuative strategies applied, right? And the first thing that we're going to do to push light back into the clouds is we're going to take the multiple scattering amount and we're going to drag that up. And you can see when we do this, this is an approximation to that thing I talked about before, which is multiple scattering, all those bounces happening inside the cloud many, many times. And we're just going to increase that until we hit a value that looks reasonable for our reference. And obviously, it's not going to look like the reference yet at all. But that seems okay, somewhere around like 0.7. And now there's other things that we can do to control this sort of multiple scattering effect. For one, we can adjust the self-shadow distance. Right now it's at 1,000. And if we bring this all the way down to 0, you can see we get no self-shadowing. And if we bring it all the way up, we get some crazier self-shadowing from far away stuff. I think 5,000 is a good value for these clouds. It gets us reasonable looking shadows from within the local part of the cloud, but it doesn't stretch too far out. And now you can see this actually changes things. Seems like we might need to make our multiple scattering amount maybe higher, but maybe not. 0.75 looks good. The other way that we can adjust multiple scattering is we can use the multiple scattering bias parameter. And what this does is this pushes the multiple scattering effect further into the cloud. So when it's 0, it pushes it all the way. And when it's all the way up at 1, we get like only multiple scattering happening at the very, very edges of the clouds. So to match our reference here, the way that I see the shadowing happening, it's pretty soft and it's not too intense. So I think somewhere around like 0.18 I like for the multiple scattering bias. I think that looks good. Obviously, there's more to be done here, right? But just looking at sort of where the shadows are, not necessarily just how dark they are, but where they are, I think that is a pretty decent representation. Great. Okay, so now the other natural problem that we can see here is our clouds are just too gray you know? And this is because they're not receiving any of the ambient blue light from the sky. And the way that we can do that is with these two parameters, the ambient height range and the ambient strength range. The ambient strength range controls the minimum and maximum strength, and the height range controls the height at which the ambient light is at its minimum and the height at which it's at its maximum. The rationale for this is that there's going to be less ambient light down at the bottom of the cloud because it's exposed to less sky. It's exposed to the ground. And there's going to be a lot of ambient light at the top of the cloud because it's exposed to the full sky dome. So we use these two sort of parameters, right? We have a height range and then a minimum at the bottom and a maximum at the top. So right now our height range is 0 to 1, which says the minimum value is at 0 and the maximum value is all the way at the top at 1. And if we pull the strength range, if we put this top value to 1, we'll start to see a little bit of an adjustment, but not too much. And now if we pull the bottom value up, we'll start to see light come into the clouds. So you can see we get some blue tinge there. And I'm just going to pull this whole thing up to something like 1 and 2. Maybe. And then I think the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the top part of the height range down and just maybe to like 0.5, just so that we hit that maximum ambient strength sooner. So you can already see this looks a little bit better. Like, you know, this is what we had before, and this is what we have now. I think we're still actually maybe missing a little bit. You know, we've still got too much shadowing going on here. I think that the shadowing needs to go away a little bit. You know, these shadows are just too dark, and here they're just very soft. You know, so I am going to increase the multiple scattering amount a little bit more and decrease the bias. I think I'm going to actually put the multiple scattering amount at 0.8 and the bias at 0.14. That's starting to look a little bit better to me. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the anisotropy. And the anisotropy is what's going to control the directionality of the light scattering. So it's what's going to give us this silver lining around the clouds. A physically accurate value for anisotropy is somewhere around 0.6. This to me looks far too intense. So I think I'm going to put it somewhere more like 0.2, 0.3. And then I think I'm actually going to pull down the multiple scattering amount a little bit to something like 0.65 maybe. There we go. That's looking a little better. And then sort of the next part of the lighting model here is going to be the vertical probability, and this is going to give us another way to sort of darken the bottom of the clouds. So I am going to darken them a little bit. I'm going to go to vertical probability strength and just bring this up a little bit, something like 0.25. And the vertical probability height range is what lets us control where this darkening gets applied. So if we want it to apply it a little higher up, we can bring this up and darken more of the cloud, and pulling it down darkens less of the cloud. So I kind of like this at 0.05 and 0.3. I think that's starting to look pretty decent. Again, we're not really quite at the reference here, but we still have a couple tricks up our sleeve. One trick here is the depth probability. And the depth probability it's a little bit of a challenging thing to explain, but basically, if you look at really, really dense clouds, you'll see that they have this like strongly kind of like cauliflower look to them. They have this like strange phenomenon where like the edges are darker than the center, and you can simulate this with this strategy that is kind of called something like the powdered sugar effect, right? Because this looks kind of like powdered sugar. It's a similar scattering behavior to how powdered sugar actually works. And the more sophisticated name for that is actually is depth probability. And if we pull the depth probability bias down, we can start to get some of that sort of cauliflower-esque darkening of the cloud edges. And we can adjust the range over which this takes effect with the depth probability height range. And we can adjust its strength with the depth probability strength range. So I'm going to keep it pretty low at the bottom and maybe like a medium amount at the top. And you can see, just to make this really, like, I'll give you a really extreme example. Like, here's what happens when you really, really go crazy with it, right? It gives you like these very like kind of bad looking, but like super exaggerated dark edges to the clouds. They look very dirty, right? So, you know, if you pull down the effect, you can just get a little bit of that in there, and it helps to kind of create those sort of dark edges to the clouds. So there's some things I'm noticing here, right? You know, one thing is that like our clouds are they just still look a little bit too gray, you know? The other thing I'm noticing is that they're just a little bit softer, you know, right? I mean, these clouds that we have right now, they're very like dense and very kind of like, you know, they're very intense. But these clouds are a lot like softer and lighter and kind of fluffier. So I think to help with that, I'm going to come over to the density parameter, which we haven't adjusted since the beginning. And I'm going to turn this down to something like 15,000 or maybe even 10,000, maybe 12,000. And I think that brings us a little bit closer to the look, the softness of the reference photo. And then to help introduce some more light and blueness here, I'm going to increase the ambient height or the ambient strength range even more, I think, to something like 1.5 and 2.5. All right, so here we go. You know, we've sort of run over all the parameters now. We've adjusted the density. I think I'm still seeing some stuff that it's not totally satisfying me. I think that maybe if we play around with the multiple scattering a little bit more, we'll get somewhere that we're a little more satisfied with. So for one, I think that things are too dark here around the bottom of the clouds. Like it's really very like there's like a stark dark flat bottom to the clouds, and I don't know if I love that. So I think what we can do is we can turn the bias down, the multiple scattering bias down even more to just get some pretty subtle shadows happening down there, but nothing too crazy. But then we can turn the amount down to help soften them. And now, you know, we're still darkening the clouds with shadowing, right? But it's not such a harsh kind of darkening. It's more like a soft darkening. And then to help just darken the bottom a little bit more, but in a softer way, we can up this vertical probability strength, I think, to something like, I don't know, keep it at like 0.4, and then maybe increase the range so that it comes up a little bit more. I'm thinking that's looking pretty good. I think I'm actually going to bring the bias back up to something like 0.11. Whoops. 0.11 for the multiple scattering bias. And then I think I am going to push the ambient light all the way up to something like 2 and 3. I mean, how high can we go with it? I think I will. I might actually go all the way up. I might go like 3 and 4 or something, which is a little bit extreme, but I think that does match the reference a lot better. So I'm going for it. Great. Okay, and now let's see. Maybe we can. What happens if we play around with the anisotropy a little bit more? No, that's too dark back there. So yeah, let's keep that around 0.2. And now to get the silver lining around here, we can increase the silver intensity parameter, which we haven't touched yet. And that'll help brighten that up. And we could bring the spread down a little bit maybe and just get that sort of nice silvery look. Okay, so now that we've got them looking pretty decent, I'm going to make a couple tweaks now to the overall shape. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to come up to the top here, and I'm going to take a look at the way the clouds are kind of like lumping on top of each other and rounding here. I'm going to adjust the rounding parameters here. So these will control the way that the clouds are like taper off at the top. So you can go to rounding and that will like round them more, and then rounding shape will sort of control how steep the rounding effect is. So I think I'm kind of a fan. Let's go back down here just to make sure that this looks reasonable. Let's see. Just up in the rounding shape, that's maybe a little bit too much. I'm a fan of like maybe 3 and 1. I think looks pretty good. 3 for rounding, 1 for the shape. And then we could sort of play around with the coverage here, but I think that looks pretty decent. You still get some sort of rounding on the top, but it's not too extreme. The bottoms are wider than the top parts are. And this is something I've noticed actually that a lot of volumetric cloud systems are lacking, is some way of sort of sculpting the top of the clouds. And I do think it is important for being able to get them to look decent. Cool. And then something else we can play around with is we can play around with how soft the tops of the clouds are. So we can up the height, we can pull down the height gradient. If we go to height gradient top here, it'll control where the top of the clouds is. And I think that with it all the way up, it's just too much. But if we pull it down, then we get something a little bit more reasonable that I think looks good. So I like that. And then the other thing we can do is we can add wind skew to the clouds. So we can say skew the clouds in a particular direction due to wind. And this is surprisingly important, I think, for getting them to look good, because I think in real life, like, clouds are usually moving in some direction and they have some skew due to the wind in that direction that they're moving. So I'm just going to set this to like maybe 1 and -1. I think that looks pretty good. it almost doesn't matter. It's like it can be good to line this up with the way that you decide to make the clouds move. But I think 1 and 1 looks pretty good to me. Cool. So we've got our clouds looking pretty close to the reference now. Not exact. We're never going to get all the way there, but they're looking pretty good. And I think that the next thing that we can do is we can sort of do a pass trying to make sure that these look reasonable with the sun in different positions. So I'm just going to go over to the time of day controller. I'm just going to move the minutes. I'm just going to pull it down here. Yeah, and I think here you can see that like we're getting something that's kind of reasonable, but when I think of clouds at sunset, I kind of think they're very dark around the sun with like a bright silver lining around them. And then back here, they're sort of like, they look kind of gray, and I think we've nailed back here. Like back here, these are kind of gray. They look pretty like, pretty dead. I think that's how clouds look at the back of the sky. But over here, I'm not seeing enough of that kind of like silver. And they're also not shadowed enough to me. So I'm going to go back over here, open the lighting tab, and I'm going to up the silver intensity like all the way and maybe pull down the spread. And that looks pretty cool. to me. And then the multiple scattering, I think I'm going to leave it where it was, but maybe just up the bias just a tad. That's looking pretty good to me. And now if we pull it over the horizon, we're going to get the moon to come out. I think these look pretty good as moonlit clouds as well. I think that looks pretty good. And now here's what they look like at daytime, which I think is also pretty nice. Maybe now that the silver intensity is a little bit too strong during the day. And you can always animate this parameter if you want to. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do to our clouds is we're going to make a move. And the way that we can do that is we can pop over to the movement tab and we can uncheck use offset like we had before. And you can see they'll start kind of moving in a subtle way. And we can just start to increase these velocities. And we can keep them pretty low for now. I'm actually going to set the coverage velocity to 0 so that the clouds stay in the same place but just have the appearance of moving. And the structure velocity, I'm going to keep that. I'm going to get that pretty high. I'm going to set that all the way up to point. Maybe that's too much. 0.02. And the detail, I'll do the same. Yeah, I like that. And you know, you can go crazy with this if you want. I mean, you can go like all the way up to do some really wild stuff if you want to. You know, I mean, like you can get some really crazily moving clouds. But you know, this at some point this is just starts to become kind of unrealistic. So I'm gonna keep it relatively tame. Something like, I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, I always like it when the detail noise moves faster than the base noise. I think that kind of creates some nice, like these tendrils are sort of moving on their own accord with the clouds then moving at their speed. I like that look. I like that a lot. Cool, so our clouds are looking pretty good, but you'll notice that if you enter game mode, your CPU main thread here, your render thread and stuff, you might be noticing that you're getting some pretty crazy frame rate tanking, and this is because we haven't adjusted these clouds to be performant at all, really. You know, we're still running at full resolution completely with lots of sample steps, and this is not what we want to do when we're trying to optimize clouds for a game. And so the fastest and cheapest way to make your clouds be more performant is to just go into the quality settings and just take reprojection frames and just slide that all the way over to 4. And now if you hit play again, you should notice very little visual quality trade-off, but your clouds should be moving really, should be very performant. So now my CPU main is about 4 milliseconds right now. Of course, if you have to, you can come back into the quality here and you can lower your step ranges. And that can also help to improve performance. That brings me down to about a little less than 4, like 3. You can see it's oscillating between 3 and 4. And finally, if you really, really want to go crazy with it and you need your step ranges to be super low, see if you make them too low, you'll start to notice these little artifacts here. And you can mitigate those by clicking Use Temporal Denoising and upping this to something like 16 frames. And that'll help to reduce those artifacts. Of course, now you'll start to see some quality trade-off here. It'll start to look a little blurry. But you know, if you really need your clouds to be extremely performant, then the trade-offs are here to help you do that. Another quick hack that can make them more performant is you can go to media 0 threshold here, and you could just set this to something like 0.01, and then similarly you can do the same thing with transmittance 0 threshold, and this can help improve performance as well, setting that to 0.01. 0.001 is a very conservative value, and generally 0.01 is fine. And just to remind you, because this is Expanse and these are volumetric clouds, we can go up into them and take a look at them from inside, and go above them too, and generally just kind of look around. Okay, coming in at the end of the tutorial here, I actually wanted to make an amendment, because after I was done filming everything, I realized that I think that there's a bug in version 1.1.4 that's causing a slight problem with the ambient light that can be resolved by clicking the Cast Shadows checkbox here. And you'll notice that when I click this, the clouds are going to get a lot brighter. Way too bright. The reason for this, I think, it has to do with something that ambient light isn't being computed properly when shadows aren't being cast by the clouds. So I just want to note that probably the right thing to do, actually, to make the clouds look as good as possible is to click Cast Shadows here, and then bring the ambient strength range way lower than it was before. So something like 0.75 to 1.5 maybe. And now you'll notice the clouds have a lot more light coming through, and I think we actually get closer to our reference photo than we were before. And the fog at the edges of the sky is a lot brighter too. So, yep. Can't believe that that's happening, but you know, that's what happens when you have a beta product. Just bugs crop up and you fix them. So now that we have this fix, actually, I think that I'm going to make a couple more adjustments. For one, I think we can take the multiple scattering bias and bring it up a little bit more now that we have more ambient light poking through. Yeah, and I think that looks much better, because now you can see we're getting these nice soft shadows because we have a lot of ambient light, but there's still noticeable shadows, right? Yeah, I think that's all I want to do. Just bring the multiple scattering bias up a little bit. All right, well, there you have it. Just as a reminder, here's the clouds we started with for the reference, and here is what we were able to produce with Expanse. I think it looks pretty good. That said, I'm sure that a number of talented 3D artists will watch this video and produce clouds that look way better than anything that I could ever make. And for those of you who do, and also everybody else, regardless of what you think of the quality of the clouds that you've made, I'd love for you to drop by our Discord and share your work. I'd love to see it. We have a little community there of people talking about how they're using Expanse, and I'd love for you to come by. So I'll post a link to that in the description. But until then, and until the next tutorial, I'll say thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.